Welcome to this Sustainable Self-Development Hypertrophysode, where it's all about sustainably hardcore ways to maximize muscle growth. We talk about everything that is related to muscle growth: training intensity, rep ranges, special training techniques, progression schemes, injury prevention, exercise selection. Take your pick before the Hypertrophysode picks you.
So, hey Wilfredo, it's great to have you back on. And in the last podcast, we talked about chest and arm training, which is arguably every guy's two favorite body parts. And in this episode, we are going to talk about some other body parts that are not as beloved by most guys, but it should be because they look really good when they're well trained, and those are the legs. So, I guess if we could start with the quads, which is basically the front thighs for like more practically speaking, I guess, but you can correct me. And so maybe we could just start with what should people know in a general sense about the quads? Is there some characteristic of that muscle group that distinguishes them in terms of how to train them? What kind of special training techniques or principles apply to them that don't apply to other muscles? Is there anything like that that people should really know about the quads?
Well, the first thing to know is their function, what they do, right? So the quadriceps extend the knee, of course. When you think quad exercises, you think of squats, lunges, leg extensions, all of which have a knee extension component to them, right? So that's the first thing to know. And then we essentially can go from there with how to train them. So the quads are actually a pretty simple body part, even despite them being a rather large body part, and there being four heads to the quadricep, hence the name quadricep. So as long as you're extending the knee, then you're training the quadricep. Now, most people believe that the squat is the best quadricep exercise. I tend to agree, although there is research showing that exercises like the Bulgarian split squat, which is basically where you put one of your legs up on a bench and then basically do like a lunging motion with the leg that's still on the floor and hold a dumbbell in one of your hands. That exercise, the Bulgarian split squat, is shown to elicit just as much quad activity as standard squat when the weight is controlled for. So you're safe training your quads with just about any variation of the squat, the lunge, split squat, or a leg extension. Now, one of the more unique things, it's not totally unique, but I think a lot of people don't really apply this to the quadricep. And we talked about this a bit, I believe, with the triceps, which is length tension relationship. So length tension relationship is just, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the relationship between how long a muscle is or how short a muscle is and how much force or tension it can generate at that length. So if a muscle is too contracted, it can't generate very much force. If it's too stretched or lengthened, then it can't generate too much force. This only applies to muscles that are biarticulate or that cross two joints. Only one part of the quadricep crosses two joints, which is the rectus femoris, which is the part right in the center of the quad. And if you look at a picture of somebody with really well-developed quads, you'll see that middle part of the quad that travels all the way up to the hip. That's the rectus femoris. So it extends the knee just like the other heads of the quadricep, but it also flexes the hip, which is basically hip flexion is bending over, pretty much bringing your upper thigh towards your torso. And since the rectus femoris does both of those things, it can't do both of those things at the same time. So if your hips are flexed, then your rectus femoris can't extend your knee. So most of the quad exercises that I just brought up, and most of the ones that most people do, lunges, squats, the leg extension, as you're extending your knee, flexed for most of the movement. And like with a leg extension, as you're extending the knee, you're sitting down, so your hips are flexed throughout the entire movement. So in order to train the rectus femoris better, what you would want to do is have your knees extend while your hips are also extended. So a standing leg extension or a sissy squat. Anybody who has followed old school bodybuilders, Arnold and Vince Gironda, and really any of the golden age bodybuilders from back in the day, they all used to do sissy squats, which is basically just it's not even really a squat. It's pretty much a standing leg extension with your own body weight. You just push your knees forward and come up onto your toes while your hips are extended. You try to keep your torso as rigid as possible and as straight as possible, and then you extend your knee to come back up.
Right.
That's how we would train that one muscle. And other than that, like I said, you stick to the basics.
Right, gotcha. And I guess this is why it's advisable, for example, on the leg extension to lay back as far as you can, right? So on the leg extension machine, this is why you would lay back as far as you can, or adjust the padding, the back padding of the machine as far as you can, so that you can.
Some people have those machines, the leg extension machines that'll lay all the way back. If you have that option, I would do that. If you don't, what I've done before is taken one of those ankle straps that you can attach to a cable machine and put the pin for the cable machine about even with your butt, and then attach the ankle strap around your ankle and face away from the cable and do a standing leg extension like that. That's one way you could do it if you don't have a leg extension machine that lays down. Or like I said, you can just do a sissy squat. All you would need to do a sissy squat is just your own body weight and probably something to hold on to so you don't lose your balance and fall over. Yeah. And with a standing leg extension also, I would suggest finding something to hold on to since you're only standing on one leg. Getting off balance is not something that you really want. If you're just trying to train your quadriceps, you want to load them as much as possible, right? Yeah. So being in danger of tripping and falling is going to take your attention away from the work you should be doing on the quads.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's just briefly touch on the different squat variations. So is there a really big fundamental difference between high bar, low bar, and back squat in general, and then front squats and Zercher squats and things like this?
Well, there's a ton of theories on this stuff. So we know that the longer the range of motion, the better it is for muscle growth. And so theoretically, that would mean for the quadriceps that the front squat would be best. The high bar squat would be second best, and then the low bar squat would be third best. Because you're more upright, and therefore the quads are going to travel further forward, and the knee is going to have to go through a longer range of motion. Now that's theoretically. That doesn't always happen because different people are built differently. And so one person's high bar squat is not going to look like the next person's high bar squat. One person's low bar is not going to look like the next person's low bar. Some people can go deeper on a squat, like those Olympic lifters. If you've ever watched them squat, where they can nearly scrape their ass on the ground. Now, if I put 225 on a bar and I let it take me all the way down, I'm still not as deep as those guys can go. My anatomy just won't allow for it because of my proportion. So it depends. Now with stance width, so how far apart your feet are, I have read studies that show that that doesn't make a difference when the range of motion is equivalent. So when the knee angle goes through the same range, then stance width isn't going to make any difference.
Right.
So yeah, I would just say if you're trying to train your quads, just pay attention to the range of motion in the knee joint. So you may need to stand sideways in front of a mirror with a bar and try out different forms to see what will allow you to get the deepest while still being comfortable. And also a note on how low you should go on the squat, because that's another thing a lot of people discuss or debate or whatever. My stance on that, once again, is that the longer the range of motion, the better. However, if you begin to round your back in an attempt to go ass to grass on a squat, then eventually you're not going to be able to train your quads because your lumbar spine is going to explode. So right. I use a similar test that I do with the stiff leg deadlift, which is stand in front of a mirror sideways and go down until I see my lower back round. And that's my range of motion, and I'm not going any deeper than that, regardless of what other people in the gym are going to think, or, you know, if somebody on Instagram is going to talk shit if they see a video. That's irrelevant. You can't hurt yourself trying to get bigger quads, because then you can't train your quads at all. So exactly. Be safe.
Right. So then let's touch briefly on another hot topic here, which is the leg press. I want to say leg press versus the squats, but that's not really the right phrasing. It's more so a question of like how, in what situation, let's say someone for some reason can't squat and they want to use the leg press. What do you think about the exercise in general? What are the limitations, and how can people make the most out of it for their quads?
So the leg press is a fine exercise. It's not going to be as good as the squat. It's actually been compared a few times in studies, and it's been repeatedly shown to perform less well than the squat does. So comparing them, yeah, the squat is better. However, like you said, there are people out there who just can't squat, who have back issues or whatever it might be. Some people have shoulder issues that don't allow them to squat. So the leg press would be a fine alternative in that context. And so making the most out of it, I would say, once again, the same thing that I said with going deep on the squat. A lot of people tend to want to get the longest range of motion possible because they understand that a longer range of motion is better. However, I have seen quite a few people, and I've worked with a few people who, in an attempt to get the longest range of motion, they round their lower back. And you can't see it if you're just looking at them, from the side. You have to be looking from an angle, and you can see a person's butt coming up off of the pad because they're rounding their lower back, because they're trying to touch their quads to their chest.
Right.
So once again, never round your lower back. Don't hurt yourself. get the longest range of motion that you can while still being safe. That's really my only rule with the leg press. We know from the squat that the width doesn't matter if the knee angle is the same, right? So if the range of motion at the knee is the same, then a wide or a narrow stance isn't going to make a difference for the quadriceps. So that probably won't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference in the squat, so it probably won't make a difference on the leg press, although of course it might. So
Right.
my one suggestion would be whatever's the most comfortable with the longest range of motion, do that.
Okay, so a couple more questions on the quads. So what about hack squats and which is a little bit controversial, Smith machine squats? So is there a way to use especially the Smith machine squat in a productive manner?
Well, yes. I'm very hesitant to tell anybody just don't do that exercise point blank period, because I'm sure that in some context that I'm not thinking of, there would be a reason to use the Smith machine squat. I don't like it just because it's putting you in this very particular plane of motion. You're going straight up and straight down. And when we're talking about the ankles moving, the knees moving, and the hips moving, and the spine moving, that's a lot of variation that's going to occur from person to person. So the idea that somebody is going to squat with a perfectly up and down bar path, I mean, that the most elite strength athletes have worked for years to get a perfect up and down bar path. The average person who's just trying to grow their quads, probably not. And I've also, this is just anecdotal evidence, been told by quite a few people that just free bar squatting feels way better than Smith machine squatting. I know people who have been injured Smith machine squatting. So I don't like it. Now the hack squat tends to have kind of the machines tend to have like a circular motion to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like they don't go straight up and down. They go in a circle. I don't know how else to explain those machines, but I would prefer that over a Smith machine squat. Yeah, I would suggest staying away from it, but I'm sure that there's somebody out there who can use it just fine.
Right. One thing that I want to ask is the application of the Smith machine for the unilateral quad, like squat variations. Because, for example, for me, like Bulgarian split squats, well, in general, I just have horrible balance. So if I was to just use heavy dumbbells, I would just never effectively overload any of those movements because all my energy would be wasted on trying to maintain balance. So what do you think using it for those?
Yeah, that could be one context. It's a lot less, you have less to worry about with like a split squat or a lunge than you do with a full-blown back squat. So that could be one potential context where you could use it. However, what I tend to suggest to people who are doing unilateral exercises for anything is to just hold on to something, right? Find anything to just hold on to with your free hand. That way you don't have to worry about the balance. And also, you're trying to train in what we're talking about. You're trying to train your quads, right? The reason why a lack of balance would be helpful would be for your core, right? Like with a Bulgarian split squat, you're holding a dumbbell with one hand. So it's pulling you to one side. So your obliques would be working to keep you upright. Now, if you hold on to something, you're taking the obliques out of it. However, we're just trying to train the quads. So who cares about the obliques in that context, right? Yeah, unless you just want to train them both simultaneously. But yeah, so that's what I do. When I do a Bulgarian split squat, I do a unilateral dumbbell overhead press standing. I do a lot of unilateral exercises, and each and every one of them, I just hold on to something just to keep my balance, so I don't have to even worry about that. I can just focus on training that muscle.
Right, and then speaking of unilateral exercises, do you think that with these squat variations there is a particular need or a benefit to including them besides just the bilateral squat variations plus some isolation exercise like the leg extension?
Yeah, everything has its place, and so the way I tend to program those things is I use the big compound movements, and I do those heavier. Like when we talk about rep ranges, I pick rep ranges based on the kind of exercise that I'm doing. So the more specific the exercise is, or the less compoundedness there is, if that's even a word, the more reps I do. So like just for the sake of variation, I'll do a squat and a lunge, and variation is important for muscle growth, and that's reflected across the research. So that's the main reason why you would want to do, a squat and a lunge and a leg extension, and have multiple exercises that you use on the quads. But so I would do like heavy squats, because going heavy makes sense in the context of the squat because you're training so many muscles. I would go 8 to 12 on lunges, which is about medium, and then 12 plus on the leg extension, just because you don't want to go heavy on that because you have your knees to worry about on a leg extension. The knees are in a more vulnerable position there. So going heavy is only going to put way more stress on the knee joint than you probably want.
Right.
So, but yeah, to answer your specific question, variation would be the reason to include some of everything, really.
Yeah, and speaking of variation, is that kind of generally how you like to program things, like 3 or so exercises per muscle group?
Yeah, depending on the muscle and how often I'm training it. So trying to think of an example, like the triceps, I only do technically one kind of isolation exercise for that, which is skull crusher. Right. Because the long head of the tricep, which is better trained by the skull crusher, is not going to be properly trained by any of the pressing that I'm doing. And so I would need an isolation exercise in that case. But all my compound movements are taking care of the lateral head of the tricep. So I don't need anything else there. I can do that one exercise for the tricep. Whereas with the quadricep, we're talking about 4 different heads, mixed fiber types, much bigger muscle. So variation will be a little bit more important for a quadricep or for the glutes, or the bigger body parts.
Right. And one last thing that I want to ask about the quads is, do you find that they like their volume tolerance? So there are some muscle groups. The next thing, for example, that we will speak about is the hamstrings. I hear a lot of people say that they generally don't tolerate a ton of volume, but for example, the delts do. And what do you find with the quads there?
I find that the quads can take a beating. What can't really take a beating is the knee.
Yeah.
That's where people run into a problem. So, yeah, once again, you have to take special care of the knee and make sure that your hamstring volume, the general rule of thumb, and this is what I was taught in college. I don't know if this has a basis in research, but this is what I learned from my professors, is like a what is it, 3-to-2 ratio hamstring work. Basically, you want to keep your hamstrings 2/3 as strong as the quadriceps, because both of those muscles are pulling on the knee joint, right? And if one of them becomes significantly stronger than the other, then you run into a problem. So make sure to get in a good amount of hamstring work and protect those knees. And yeah, if you start to get knee problems, then back off the volume. But like for me personally, I train my quads every day, 3 to 4 sets, and I'm just fine. Right. And that's what I have most of my clients do as well, do quad work just about every day, and they're fine as well.
Brilliant. So I think we pretty much knocked out the quads. Is there anything that we didn't touch on and it would be good to mention?
No, I think that's it with the quads.
Cool beans. All right, then let's knock out these hemis. So hamstrings, just like we introduced the quads, what is there generally to know about the hamstrings that's important?
So the quads, I'm still talking about the quads. They also have 4 heads. A lot of people don't know that. So 3 of the hamstring heads are responsible for flexing the knee, basically a hamstring curl. And then one of them is also attached to the hip and extends the hip. So think like stiff leg deadlift. So the heads that are responsible for knee flexion are the long head, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. And the one that's responsible for hip extension is the short head. So for optimal hamstring growth, we're going to need, just like I said with the quads, where you want to extend the knee with your hips flexed and with your hips extended to train the different parts of the muscle. You're going to do the same thing with the hamstring and do a leg curl with your hips extended and with your hips flexed to train the different parts.
Right.
Cool. So then let's just follow up this with a simple question. What are the best hamstring exercises?
So once again, like we talked about last time, the more free the exercise, the better it's going to be. So probably the most free hamstring exercises are going to be the stiff leg deadlift and the glute ham raise. There's a lot of research on the Nordic ham curl, which is basically a glute ham raise with a slow eccentric. Basically, you lower yourself for a few seconds and then explode back up. There's a lot of research suggesting that that's very good at strengthening the hamstring. And like I said, with the quads, we want to keep those hamstrings strong to maintain the integrity of the knee, to keep a person from getting injured. So the Nordic ham curl is really good. A lot of people have trouble with the glute ham raise at first because they're not strong enough to do it. So in that case, a Nordic ham curl would be really good. You lower yourself for 3 seconds and then push yourself back up to the starting position and then lower and push up. That's a good way to get people strong at that exercise in the beginning. And then I would also suggest a seated hamstring curl. Some of the heads don't or aren't involved in hip extension. You want to have the hips flexed while you flex the knee also to train the different portions of the hamstring. So like the stiff leg deadlift and the glute ham raise are both knee flexion while the hips are, the glute ham raise is knee flexion while the hip is extended. The stiff leg deadlift is hip extension while the knees are extended. which registers similarly. So you want to have something with the hips flexed while you curl the knee. So a seated hamstring curl along with those other two exercises is what I would have most people do.
Cool. All right. So let's touch on a couple of points. So you mentioned the stiff-legged deadlift. How would you say the stiff-legged deadlift compares to the Romanian deadlift?
So so my thing with the Romanian deadlift is I'm perfectly fine with someone having a bit of bend in the knee. And just for anyone who doesn't know, the Romanian deadlift is it's a stiff leg deadlift with a slight bend in the knee, and the stiff leg deadlift, the knee is totally extended. Right. So the more bent the knee is, the more we're getting into the territory of just a standard deadlift, you know? Yeah. Now, if somebody can maintain a very strict knee bend where it's not all that great, then fine. But I find that people, they tend to turn the stiff leg deadlift or the Romanian deadlift into just a regular old deadlift because they start putting on weight and they're just trying to get the weight up. And so they start to move their knee. And once you start to extend that knee and flex that knee, now you're bringing your quadriceps into the picture, and that's not what we're trying to do. So right. If the knee is staying in the same position, then there's not going to be much of a difference from the stiff leg to the Romanian, because that knee is not very flexed. You know, like a Romanian, it's really a tiny difference between the two. So yeah, as long as you're not, you know, moving your knees a lot during the exercise, then you'll be fine.
Yeah, I guess what I noticed with the Romanian deadlift is that people kind of get into this, like they just start loading it up and they can get ridiculously strong with it. But when you actually look at the range of motion, it's pretty much identical with that of conventional deadlift, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, you know, if you're trying a conventional deadlift, then you should conventional deadlift. But if your express goal is to train your hamstrings, then you need to stiff leg deadlift or Romanian deadlift and keep the quadriceps out of it. That's not what you're trying to do, so don't do it. And also with range of motion, I see a lot of folks who, you know, they're trying to get the longest range of motion possible, and so they go too low and they end up rounding their lower back. And so, like I suggested earlier, what I do is I get in front of a mirror and stand sideways, and I do a stiff leg deadlift all the way down until I start to see my back begin to round. And that's my range of motion. That's where I'm stopping. For me, that's not all the way. I'm not touching the weights all the way to the floor again, because for me to get there, I would have to round my lower back, and I'm not going to risk an injury for a few extra degrees of range of motion. So yeah, be careful with that.
Right, and you also mentioned the leg curl exercise. You mentioned that you prefer the seated as opposed to the lying one, correct?
Yeah, well, because with the lying leg curl, we have a better alternative, which is the glute ham raise. The glute ham raise is the closed chain version of the lying ham curl. Yeah. Right, so closed chain means that the body is moving. Open chain means only the weight is moving. And closed chain has been shown to be better than open chain for muscle growth. So we have a better version of the lying ham curl. We don't really have a better version of the seated ham curl. I've yet to find a way to mimic that with a closed chain exercise. So I can't really replace the seated ham curl yet. I don't know. Maybe I'll create something here coming up. But yeah, I've yet to find another alternative for that. So that's why I suggest people do the seated ham curl and a Nordic ham curl if they can't do the glute ham raise. Because that, like I said, that becomes an issue. People who aren't strong enough to do the exercise are like, well, what should I do? Because I can't do this one. So the Nordic ham curl to get strong at it in the beginning and then transition into a full glute ham raise.
Yeah. One thing that I noticed with myself is, I mean, to be honest, I never did the glute ham raises just simply because I just never had it in any of my gyms. But one thing that I noticed with the lying leg curl is that once I get, like basically once my knee is fully extended, I think it's called pulpitus muscle, like that's kind of the back end of the knee. That area just starts to feel super, super weird and awkward. And so I always kind of have to pay attention not to fully stretch. So I guess that would be kind of tricky if I did the glute ham raise, because then you can't really control it as much.
Yeah. And see, the thing with that is, the majority of the hamstring, it crosses both the hip and the knee. And so when your hips are extended, those muscles are basically stretched at that hip. Now, when you also extend your knee all the way, the muscle can't properly extend at that knee also, right? It's the length tension relationship thing again. It's why people, when you bend forward, like in a stiff leg deadlift, that's why you feel that extreme stretch in the hamstring. Yeah. Because you're stretching at multiple joints. So yeah, that's another I tend to suggest that people stay away from fully extending the knee while the hips are extended, just because the getting too stretched once again is it's not the best for muscle growth. The muscle can't generate very much force or tension in that position, so I'd stay away from that. But it might be just something with being too stretched, and that's why you feel that awkwardness at your knee whenever you lower the weight.
Right. So for the same reason, so what's safe with the stiff-legged deadlift is not safe with the lying leg curl because the hips are extended.
Right, probably, yeah. And also with the stiff leg deadlift, since it's a closed chain exercise, the body is more free to move around, and so it can position you to be safe. Like the body is doing everything it can to keep you from breaking or dislocating something, right?
Yeah.
When you're on a machine and you're locked into this specific plane of motion, then the body can't move like it needs to. It can't shift the tension to a different portion of the muscle. It can't it can't shift a joint to a better position to handle the load. So you can end up in an awkward position that will get you hurt on a machine that, if you look at it anatomically, it's not very much different from a stiff leg deadlift. Like, that's why you just made that relationship, right? Like in both of those cases, it's similar, right? We have extended hips and extended knees at one point. So why does one hurt and not the other? Well, yeah, because one's more free and the body can do what it needs to do to protect you. And with the machine, it really can't. So.
Right. One thing that we haven't touched on is, what do you think about the back extension or hip extension on the reverse hyper for hamstrings?
I would prefer the stiff leg deadlift because it's once again, you're more free to move with a stiff leg deadlift. But the hip extension is not bad. It's a fine exercise. I mean, you can load it, which I used to do. You could, use a dumbbell or even a barbell if you start getting really strong at it. But it could be a fine alternative to the stiff leg deadlift.
Right. And one, well, I have, I think, two more questions on this, but one is so people who do glute work like hip thrusts, unilateral hip thrusts, stuff like that, should they count volume from those exercises towards hamstring?
So if you are extending the hips, so like a glute, not a glute ham raise, a stiff leg deadlift, I would count that toward glute volume. The glute ham raise, I know it's called a glute ham raise, but the problem is there's no movement at the hip. The hips are extended for the whole exercise. So the glutes are working, but not very hard. They're just maintaining an isometric contraction. They're essentially just staying still, right?
Right.
An eccentric and concentric motion is where the muscle really has to do its work. So there's an eccentric and concentric on the stiff leg deadlift, so I'd count that. But like the ham curls, no, I wouldn't count that toward glute volume.
Right. Okay. And then I think my last question on this is, what kind of rep parameters do you like to work with the hamstrings? Because we hear a lot about, the hamstrings being fast twitch dominant and best trained with low reps. What do you think about this?
So I've read that also. I'm beginning to be more inclined to believe that the rep ranges aren't as important as just doing every rep range, right? Like training heavy, training with moderate weight, training with light weight. Greg Nuckols, you know Greg Nuckols from
Sure.
String Theory? Yeah. He wrote an article with a ton of citations, like he always does, where they talked about the difference in muscle growth between different rep ranges from, heavy 1 to 5 to moderate 6 to 12 to light 12 and up, just to see if it made a difference. And across a ton of research, it just didn't. All the people had the same or very similar amounts of muscle growth. So I know the fiber type argument, but it's just not panning out in the further research. So I would suggest going heavier on some exercises and then lighter on other ones, just to cover all your bases. Just the same way we use variation in the exercises, we use variation with the rep ranges. So I would go probably a little heavier on the stiff leg deadlift, moderate on like a glute ham raise, and light on a ham curl machine.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the more free the exercise, the heavier I go on it, because I can't go heavy on the machine, because to me that's more dangerous than going the exercise.
Right. No, that makes a ton of sense.
Cool. Awesome. Anything that we didn't touch on regarding hamstrings that would be important?
No, I think we covered everything.
Cool beans. Awesome. Then awesomeness. We pretty much knocked out both body parts really well, and I think this will be very helpful for people. So yeah, I think we can wrap it up. Just as usual, just tell people where they can find you and find out more about your work.
Yeah, you can check me out at Wilfredo, WILFREDO fitness.com. And yeah, I'm by the time this is out, I will have totally redesigned my website and have a ton of free stuff, resources and videos and ebooks, and I've got a ton of stuff coming out. So be sure to check out my website.
Awesome. Yeah, guys, check out his website. He has a lot of cool guys on different body parts and just very informative. So cool beans. Thank you so much, Wilfredo, for doing this. And yeah, talk to anybody next time. All right, guys, Abel here again. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe on YouTube if you watched it there. I come out with new content every week there, whether it's in the form of a podcast episode like this, which I actually aim to do one of every week, or some shorter informational video. Also, if you could just leave a comment and suggest some people that you'd like me to interview or just topics you'd like me to cover, it would be very helpful to know how I can better serve you. And if you listen to it in podcast format, if you could leave a rating on iTunes, it would greatly help out the show, and I would be more than grateful for it. So thanks, guys, for hanging out up until now. Thanks for being here, and see you all next week.